Hi guys! My name is Kallen O'Connor. I'm a violinist in the Akron Symphony. I play in the first violin section, and today I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my instrument, the violin, and how it works, and why I chose to play it, and its place in the orchestra and what it does there. So I started playing violin when I was about 8 years old. I really wanted to play the cello after having already taken piano lessons for a while, but my mom thought it would hurt my back, so she started me on violin instead. And so here we are, still playing a lot of years later, almost 20 years later. So what is the violin? It's basically just a piece of wood. It can be made of a bunch of different types of wood. And people made violins all the way back in the 1600s, and people are still making violins today. So you can have really old violins, you can have somewhat newer violins. So how does the violin work? Well, there are obviously two parts, the violin itself and the bow, both of which are usually required to make sound, but not always. So your violin is comprised of the body of the instrument, which is just the piece of wood, the bridge, which holds up your strings, the fingerboard, which is this big black thing here, and these are your pegs that help tune your instrument. This is a piece put on afterwards called the chin rest, so it doesn't slide out from under your chin while you're trying to play it. And these are the violin's F-holes, which are basically cuts in the top of the wood so that the sound can project out of the body of the instrument while you're playing. The strings themselves are, in my case, made of metal or some kind of wire that's usually wrapped with another kind of wire. They can even be plated in things like platinum or gold or anything you'd like, depending on what kind of sound you want. Originally, violins used animal guts as strings, so there's your fun fact for today. The strings on the violin are pulled to a specific tension to get them to make a specific sound based on the thickness of the string itself. So right now you can hear this string is a lot lower than the top string. There are 4 strings on the instrument. You can make them move by essentially shortening or expanding the length of the string, either with your tuning pegs or with your fingers that are going to create different pitches. So on the very bottom, we have our G string, which is our lowest note. And the top string is E, which is our highest. In the middle, we've got D and A. Everything is a fifth apart, which means there's 5 notes in between. When we tune our instruments, we're trying to make sure the pitches synchronize with each other without us putting our fingers down. So it might sound something like this. Sounds pretty good together. If I use my finger, I can go up a step and change the pitch on one of the strings from the D, and now we're at an E. The lowest pitch our violin can produce is the bottom string, the open string G. The highest pitch is if I move my fingers all the way up on the E string, I'm going to be able to hit a really, really high pitch, which you may not even hear the sound of or know the note for. It can go really high, although usually we don't have things that are written quite that high. How does it get the sound out of the instrument? The bow is used to pull across the strings, thus creating vibrations which bounce off the inside of the instrument and project out through these holes in the wood that we talked about earlier. The bow is also made of wood on the top part, but the bottom part is actually horsehair from a tail of a horse. We use something called rosin, which is essentially dried tree sap, to put on our bows that make it stickier, that will grasp the strings, that will help us produce the sound. So that's the primary way we make sound on the violin. However, it's not the only way. Sometimes we'll be encouraged by composers to actually pluck our strings to make sound. So we can actually use our finger, or our left hand in this case, to make plucking noise. So clearly that's not as loud as using the bow, but it is a neat effect. Another cool way that we can make sound on the violin wasn't really used much until the late 1800s, and that's when composers occasionally started having us play on the wood part of the bow. This is a technique we call collegno, and it has an interesting eerie noise if you think about it. You can hear the stick against your strings making sound, but it's obviously not very loud either, so it's not used quite so often. The other string instruments in the orchestra function very similarly. They're built similarly with pieces of wood, and they're also played with bows. So that would be the viola, the cello, and the double bass. The violin's the smallest, followed by the viola, which looks a little bit bigger and is still played under your chin. The cello, which they typically play between their legs, and the double bass, which is so large that a lot of times you stand up to play it. The violin, being the smallest, can make the highest sounds, while the double bass, as the biggest instrument, produces the lowest sound as it has so much body on which sound can resonate and bounce back and forth. Now in the orchestra, you may have noticed there are a plethora of violins, and some violas, and some cellos, and some double basses, and then a lot fewer of all the other instruments. The string section is typically providing a pad for the other instruments to build on. They can sometimes do, in my opinion, the neatest effects because you can do really cool things, like you can play really soft if you need to, or you can play really loud. A lot of times, composers give the melody to the first violin since there's so many options of sound from which to choose. The second violin is usually tasked with some sort of inner harmony, as well as the viola, and the double bass and the cello usually provide a bass line. Not always, though. A lot of times, composers like to switch things around so that other string instruments get the melody, or other instruments in the orchestra. If you've been to an orchestra concert before, you may have noticed that one violinist comes out alone at the beginning and sits in the seat closest to the conductor and to the edge of the stage. Typically, they tune the orchestra before we start so we can make sure that all the orchestra is in tune with each other. They're also kind of responsible for holding the orchestra together along with the help of the conductor, of course. They get the solos, and they generally help make decisions for the section, as well as the rest of the strings section, so we can start to sound more unified together. That role is called the concertmaster. As I mentioned before, the violin, and of course the rest of the string section, has a very large repertoire of sounds from which to choose. So we can make really soft sounds, we can make really loud sounds, we can make really high sounds or really low sounds. We can use our fingers to pluck the strings and get all sorts of cool effects. And composers often draw on all of these techniques that we use to produce different emotions in the music. So if you've ever been listening to a horror movie film score, for example, you might hear something really cool where we're playing on the other side of the bridge and it's a tremolo and it sounds something like this. That would sound pretty scary. Or you might hear a really beautiful melody that serves as the primary theme in a romantic comedy movie. Or you can do a combination of all of these effects and you might get a really empowering power ballad, something like this. Recognize that? So now I'm going to take some of those techniques that we just talked about and play for you a medley. A medley is basically just a combination of snippets of different pieces. And the pieces that I've chosen for you are all part of symphonies, which are big long works for orchestra. These are all composed by a man named Beethoven, who lived in the 1800s. An interesting fact about him, if you don't know this already, is that he was completely deaf by the end of his career, which means he couldn't hear anything even as he's trying to write these large symphonic works. I've selected some tunes that you may have heard either from movies or a previous trip to the orchestra, or maybe even on another instrument. So see how many you recognize as I play. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you learned a little bit more about the violin and what makes it work, and hopefully you'll have a little bit of a greater appreciation the next time you hear one being played or you go to an orchestra concert, or maybe you'll even want to start taking up a stringed instrument yourself. Have a good rest of your day.